Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bound. Today, after having recently aired the first of 2 episodes celebrating the great and the good of the art world at the Venice Biennale, we're going behind the curtain to look at the less benign side of art, and specifically the art market. Our portal to explore the seamy underbelly of selling expensive works is opened by the self-professed failed art dealer Orlando Whitfield, whose new book, All That Glitters, tells the story of his earlier pre-writing career as an art student and occasional gallerist. Front and centre in the tale is his on-off friendship with Inigo Philbrick, a fellow art student who quickly became a big-time art dealer, speedily followed by becoming a notorious convicted art world fraudster, and all by his early 30s. And that takes some doing. Whitfield's story starts when he and Philbrick are 20-something Goldsmith students, padding through their studies but making fast friends, attending every private view in London they can, and certainly for Philbrick, starting to build a complicated network of art market contacts. They both, though, wanted to deal in art. The duo sold a Paul Arago work in a nefarious-seeming deal in a European hotel, and they tried to spirit a Banksy from its moorings on a garage door in East London. Stuff only as creative, or as dodgy, as the next wannabe Gagosian. But soon Philbrick was working for White Cube founder Jay Jopling and turning a £35,000 a year salary into £35,000 a month and becoming suitably suited, booted, chauffeured and increasingly aloof. Philbrick's non-Jopling dealings, his very large bits on the side, had partially turned him to the dark side of the force. He sold 220% of a work by Rudolf Stingel. He then sold a restored, in inverted commas, work by the same artist that had been damaged to the point where its maker wanted it destroyed. After a long story, and after going on the run to Vanuatu in the South Pacific, Philbrick was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison for an $86 million wire fraud. Icarus? Well, Orlando Whitfield will tell us all. And for context on how widespread Philbrickishness is in the great unregulated big money soup that is the art market, I'll also be joined by Melanie Gerlis, journalist and commentator for the FT and the Art newspaper. First up, here is Orlando Whitfield, author of the incendiary, unputdownable All That Glitters. He describes the first time he spent time with Inigo at a house party and the early days of their friendship.
It was the first time that I'd really had a conversation with someone who was completely on my wavelength about everything, not just politics, but art and books and music and humour as well. We had, and hope still have, a similar sense of humour. I mean, he was a sort of Gatsby-esque figure. Yeah. He was mysterious, talked about in the same way that...
An intoxicating company. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, intoxicating is certainly the word for that night, as I recall it.
Did it sound like that was in italics?
Yes, it rather did. Let's not go into substances and liquids at this point. But there was a lot of that. And from that point on, we really did become quite fast friends quite quickly. I then spent that summer in New York working. I did an internship at Christie's in New York, and Inigo had gone back to live with his parents in Connecticut. And he used to come into the city quite frequently and come and see me at Christie's and, sneer at the Rauschenbergs or whatever. He was already kind of had this extraordinary hubris about him. But the thing about him was that he could always back it up.
Yeah.
There was no veneer at that point, at any rate.
And the art world is an intoxicating place. The parties that used to be the parties in the music industry of the 70s and 80s seem to have picked up their bags and walked to the art world of the 90s till the present day, I'd say. There's some great fun to be had. It all centres around the wealthy and around money, and that sort of, when they look in the mirror, they see art, I suppose. What for you?
You're looking at the mirror from, I suppose. Some people. Yeah. Anyway, let's not.
Your father was an auctioneer, or was at Christie's, and you weren't an uninitiate in the art world yourself. So, did you find it an intoxicating world to be in? You and Inigo skipping merrily through London, like fun young men as you were, loving art, loving the parties, and all the rest of it.
Absolutely.
Your hearts were in the right place at the beginning.
They certainly were, I think. Yeah, I mean, while my father had been in that world, he was very much an arm's length father when it came to his career. That was a separate thing. That was
So you weren't sort of trailing around sale rooms and meeting?
A little bit of that, but, it was much less the fine art, the contemporary art. He was, by the time I was kind of old enough to go to sale rooms, he was running all of the auction houses for Sotheby's outside of London. So it was the less glamorous part, sadly. And certainly he would never have taken me to a gallery opening or anything of that ilk. Whereas, Inigo had been going to those and being babysat by Frank Stella and all this, I mean, he was not far off being kind of, he wasn't Larry Gagosian's son, but he was pretty close to being kind of an art world princeling from day one. And I was definitely familiar with that stuff. But I was very fortunate to find him at that particular point, because Goldsmiths was, as I said earlier, was not just, it wasn't really art history, it was art theory. And so we got to see very little. We weren't sort of shown pictures or artworks at
So it was very much about the talking of it,
was
rather
entirely
than the
about
inspecting it, getting right up close to the canvas.
And with Inigo, I realised that we could, we were in London. We had 3 or 4 days of lectures a week and an abundance of free time. Gloriously, I was one of the last old system students, so I didn't, my student loan was relatively, decent, and I didn't have to pay tuition fees. And so we just wandered around London going to every private view, and we saw everything. For a period of 3 or 4 years, we genuinely saw every show in London, and it was, to see them with him was an education, because otherwise I would have been flying blind, turning up to Viner Street and looking at, I don't know, Keith Coventry's work or, what have you, and just not being able to understand it. Whereas going with Inigo, I learned to kind of ape his confidence and his understanding of these things. And not only that, it encouraged me to actually go and develop my own understanding and taste.
Now, you guys went out. Part of this was attending openings and private views, the warm white wine and the small talk. It sounded like it was larger talk than the normal small talk. If you were actually thinking and talking about these artworks, so many of these parties, people have their backs to the paintings, right? And this is so much to wear them. But it sounded like you guys were obviously super engaged in that. But then soon after, you started you were selling things. You sold a Paul Arago, and you tell the story with brilliant urgency, and we should tell our listeners that you're such a good writer. This really rings true, but it really resonates, this book. It's a wonderful, entertaining read, and a kind of moving one. And we'll come into love and loss and all those things perhaps by the end of our conversation, Orlando. Tell us a little bit about seeing this Banksy on a garage in Clerkenwell. And you were a little bit, you were backwards in coming forwards. Inigo Philbrick certainly wasn't. Tell us a little bit about that first encounter with trying to prize something off a garage.
Yeah, it was actually after a quite drunken night on Viner Street. We were coming home, walking back. Inigo used to like to walk a lot, so I was desperate to take buses, and Inigo was always keen to walk. And so we walked along through Clerkenwell, and there's a scooter shop. It's still there, the shop. And on the wall in its kind of car park or scooter park next to the shop, there was a quite large Banksy of some pensioners standing around a kind of Run DMC style photograph, but pensioners instead of, young rappers, with the words emblazoned across the top, old school with a K. And we'd previously tried to get this, previously tried to buy a metal door from the back of an apartment building or an office building on the other side of Clerkenwell, and had been rather quickly gazumped on that front. But this place, we really tried quite hard to get structural engineers and builders in to kind of figure out how we could take this Banksy off the wall. Inigo, with remarkable kind of ambition, managed to get some father of a high school friend of his to put up $30,000 in backing to get this thing off the wall. And I mean, it all came to naught because someone bought it before us. I mean, I think the Banksy star was very much rising at that point, and it didn't quite work out. But I mean, to be trying to do that stuff,
it's chutzpah, right? I mean, this is like you make the art world is dealing in it, especially the secondary market perhaps. But this is all about chutzpah, right?
I was and still am a pretty anxious person, and anxiety never really seemed to be something that Inigo had time for. Even if it was under the surface, he would never let it show. Being around that, I kind of figured that it might rub off on me. It didn't, but
so there is an idea of Inigo being a great pretender, but also obviously a great persuader. Did it feel dangerous? At what point, maybe I should ask, did it start to feel dangerous? And you sort of used the word hubris as well. At what point did it feel like fast forward, you're at the bar at the Connaught Hotel, super chic, beautiful place in Mayfair, and Inigo's walking in his Savile Row suit, dishing out 20s to the maitre d' and the bar lady and all the rest of it. At what point did you go, wow, this guy's doing well, or did you feel, hang on, where's all this dosh coming from?
I mean, I remember when Inigo told me that Jay Jopling, the founder of White Cube, had decided to back him in opening a gallery that started as Modern Collections on Mount Street and then became Inigo Philbrick Gallery afterwards. I remember Inigo telling me this and thinking, that's, he was 24 or 5 when that happened, and, Jay was then and still is one of the world's preeminent art dealers. I mean, there are very few art dealers who have, encapsulated an entire generation of artists, and Jay is one of them, and has been an incredible force in not just British art but more widely. So Inigo got this job with him kind of 2 or 3 years out of university, while the rest of us were, essentially photocopying and getting coffee, despite having degrees and everything. Yeah. And so at that point, that stretched credulity, even him telling me that. But then it happened, and then, he did start making so much money so very quickly. And
a lot of that... This was kosher, right? This was kosher. You say in the book that he kind of went from earning £35,000 a year to £35,000 a month.
More or less overnight.
He was selling he was collaborating with Jay Jopling on mostly secondary market works. This was Modern Collections was put together. Part of it was Jay Jopling's collection, or things that he was trading, not under the auspices of White Cube, not new art by his stable of artists kind of stuff. And this is amazing. Suddenly he's gone from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, right? I mean, this is hair raising, literally. Did he change?
I don't know whether he changed or whether he developed in a way that was almost inevitable with his particular skill set and the kind of money that he was able to attain with that skill set. I mean, it's one of those perennial questions, do people change? I'm not sure really that they do, but they maybe, there's a nice Oscar Wilde line, you are who you are, having secretly become the person you wanted to be. So no, I don't think he changed, but I suspect that the moral ambient temperature of the art market was both very suited to, as I say, a skill set, his particular way of kind of seeing the world, but also may have been something that corrupted and otherwise, when I first met him, he wanted to be kind of a curator in a commercial, kind of thing. But in a commercial art setting. I mean, and that's something that happens much, much more these days. People like Larry Gagosian and the bigger auction houses and big galleries, they do hire curators to do that work, and it's exciting and dynamic, much quicker and less kind of committee-led than the sort of thing that Inigo's father would have done.
There's a sort of the glamour and the money and the travel and the exclusivity of the art world is a kind of law unto itself, isn't it? It's a super attractive thing, and maybe that is a corrupting thing. You talk about this a bit in the book as well, that it is the world's, other than drugs, it's the world's largest unregulated market.
And it's illegal, unregulated
and it's all
market.
done on it's illegal. Yeah, it's done on what we will call in inverted commas gentlemen's agreements. Most of it, right? A lot of it, right?
All of the gentlemen having agreements, but none of them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to paraphrase Oscar Wilde here.
More of a gentleman's club agreement, as it were. Yeah.
But is there something in the nature of, Inigo kind of went off the deep end and then some, but is there something about the way that the art world works that can push people like that to become slightly monstrous or become fraudsters, I wonder? Obviously,
there are frauds which have happened in the art world, and as I say, the moral ambient temperature and also the lack of regulation make those frauds easier to pull off. But I don't think that it necessarily turns people into fraudsters. I think
you have to kind of be born that way. You have to have that little. You have to. I think little switch goes.
As
off
I think I say in the book somewhere, not to get all kind of quotey here, but it's a bit like that Hemingway line about bankruptcy. It's very gradual and then all at once.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to a friend of mine who an art dealer still, and we kind of, and a lot of us of the same generation of Inigo marvelled at this success. Quite frankly, I mean, both financial and kind of reputational. None of us could kind of work out how it was happening. A lot of people kind of figured that he must have family money, and none of that was true. What he did have was this extraordinary confidence. And also later on, we used to say, this cannot be pure art dealing. And I think at around the 2014 mark, when I'd worked for him at that point for a couple of years at Modern Collections, what I saw was so far away from what I understood art dealing to be. It was just trading at a certain point. But then the money, suddenly it was not just business class and first class flights. Suddenly it was private jets. And as my good friend Hugo de Ferrenti, who you mentioned earlier, once said to me about Inigo, if you're flying on private jets by the time you're 30, you're not going to be flying on them by the time you're 40. And he was absolutely right. Sometimes a story is just a story, but there are some stories which, through an unexpected prism, tell us something about the world in which we live, about the people we are. Inigo's career in the upper echelons of the contemporary art market had been meteoric, except meteors don't rise, they plummet. Radical bodies hurtling and tumbling through space, they become meteors only in the incandescent moment that they enter the Earth's atmosphere, trailing shimmering fire as they break apart, appearing to soar for a bright and fleeting moment, imprinted forever on the memories of those who see them. The crash is devastating and destructive and final.
From halfway through the book to the end, you can sort of see what's going to happen. Some people might have known before they read the book. It's a well-documented case. But you sort of, talking about selling 220% of a painting, you also kind of feel like there's a sense that Inigo is juggling, he's juggling 3 balls, then it's 10 balls, then it's 25 balls, suddenly they're on fire. There is this sense of there is an Icarus moment. It is analogous to your key character and friend Inigo Philbrick. What and we won't get into the court case. There are some notable moments in the courtroom. Sure. Why did you do it? Why did he do it? What did he tell the judge?
For the money.
So there you go. Again, chutzpah till the last. When was the last time you saw Inigo? And do you think you'll see him again?
The last time I saw him is documented in the book. We had this sort of weird afternoon at his gym, which was underneath a large 5-star hotel in Mayfair, which is a bizarre thing. And I've no idea if we'll see each other again. It's certainly not something that either of us have made plans for.
Was this book a cathartic exercise for you?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was an education in my own life in an odd way. I don't really think I had quite realised what that period of time had been. And, despite all the evidence to the contrary, I believed Inigo for the longest time that he was just this young man in over his head. And I cannot believe that anymore. And it was a process of realising who I had been friends with for 15 years to write this book, to look, kind of forensically at the evidence that not only he sent me, but that, the FBI gathered and the district attorneys in the southern districts of New York presented to the judge. So, yeah, I mean, a quite strange thing to realise that this really formative, important figure in your life has been someone very different.
And how's the art world taken this? And you say near the end of the book that you sort of you still obviously have friends in it who are dealers, who are probably artists as well. Obviously you ran a gallery, you will know and love art. How are they taking it? I wonder if they feel that, is there a bit of shitting on your own doorstep, or is there? Do they think you've uncovered something and that will make the market a better place and the art world generally a better place?
I mean, whether my book changes anything, I really doubt. There's a line, I think, somewhere towards the end of the book of Larry Gagosian's, where he's asked roughly the same question, but back in 1988, so a considerable amount of time ago, by an interviewer in the Village Voice, and he's asked, what would he change about the art world? And he says, I think with a kind of wry grin, to answer that would be like asking Dante what he would change about the structure of hell. I've had a remarkably positive response from most people in the art world. A lot of people ringing me and saying, am I in the book? Am I implicated? No, no one else is implicated. And I hope that the art market or the art world, think that the book is at least accurate in terms of, describing just how that world works. It's remarkably opaque to even people within that world. There is no one art world. There are many art worlds. And so I hope that this book goes some way, because that's something I've always been perplexed by, the general public's fascination with and complete ignorance of this market.
Orlando, I thought your book is brilliant. It's super entertaining, kind of dangerously so, perhaps. And it's brave too. You open up about your own life, about your family life, and obviously your erstwhile friend Inigo Philbrick. It's wonderful stuff. All that glitters. Orlando Whitfield, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And that was Orlando Whitfield. All That Glitters is out now, published by Profile Books. Now we turn to Melanie Gerlis, who writes the fascinating art market column in the FT every weekend, reporting on fairs, auctions, private sales and acquisitions. She recently wrote a piece for the paper, weaving in reviews of several art world exposés, one of which was Whitfield's. Melanie, thank you so much for joining us on the programme today. I guess first things first, this is a book, Orlando Whitfield's book about Inigo and about the broader art market that he dipped a toe into, is very much about high dudgeon. How common is this sort of high dudgeon? In an FT article a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned the sort of dusty and mundane corners of the art market that actually make up a lot of it. So just how rare is this kind of artful behaviour?
Yeah, I think it definitely is rare. I think the art market mostly is full of, hundreds of galleries and artists and various people in between who are just getting their day's job done. And it just seems to happen that when the money gets very, very, very steep, the people will play at the edges.
Yeah, it does seem like that. It seems like the more zeros are involved. And I suppose it's the nature of certain artworks itself. I mean, Inigo Philbrick's, this Picasso Stingle that sort of he kind of put together in a Mayfair garage is part of it. Some of the artwork lends itself to obfuscation, perhaps, as well, does it?
Yes, I agree. And I mean, there are some elements of Orlando Whitfield's book where you slightly find yourself laughing at your own market. I mean, there's one description, I think, of some mats, plastic welcome mats by Felix Gonzalez Torres, that when Inigo didn't quite have the work he should have had, he just mass bought a bunch of mats. And that does slightly make you laugh at conceptual art and how it must look from the outside. But of course, these are quite serious issues.
And I suppose it comes down to, and everyone will, anyone in the art world and art market listening to this will scoff at this, but I suppose it comes down to a very simple thing of artworks are worth what anyone is willing to pay for them. There are no price tickets on items in galleries or at art fairs, and people would obviously look askance if this sort of suddenly happened. But there perhaps needs to be somewhere between, there not quite being price tags on it, but some form of regulation perhaps.
Well, I think there should be price tags on it, actually. I don't think that is so extreme. If you're buying a house or a car, you have reference points, and it's just so patchy. If I want to see what a work's sold for at auction, I can see that. But if it's sold in any other way, I can't. And I agree with you. We're in a world where we are pricing the priceless, but there is a price. And I just think if you don't want people to laugh at you, or if you want to be taken as seriously as we all take our world seriously, then why not be just a bit more transparent? Because otherwise I think we're opening ourselves up for, at best, ridicule and at worst, these scams.
It is a strange thing, though. There is something, maybe the wrong word to use is romantic, but there is something about this kind of quote-unquote gentleman's agreements, the handshake culture, trust, which you can put in inverted commas the size of this building. But there is something imbued with perhaps, as I say, romance, or just the idea that we're dealing with artworks, that we have to be imprecise when we're judging them somehow. This comes down to even the figures that are attached to them, perhaps.
I agree, and it's partly why we all do what we do, is because we are attracted to the romance of it. I think that's a very good way of putting it. I just think, and as I wrote actually in the FT, that we can't really have it both ways, because this romance is coming at quite a cost. And I think once you're taking people's money, you just need to be a little more transparent. I'm not saying the art world needs to be as regulated as the financial world, because it's a much smaller market. And as you say, we're dealing in kind of unique, quirky goods. But I think there's a way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll raise a glass to that, Melanie. You mentioned, going back to your FT roundup of Orlando Whitfield's book and a couple of other similar ones that are on the market at the moment, you used that phrase, the sort of increasingly financialised environment of the art market. I'm thinking of bonds and loans and things that are more in the realm of private banking. Can you tell me what you mean by that financialised environment, that phrase you used?
Well, there are increasingly bonds and loans, and I mean, guarantees. One of the messes that Inigo Philbrick managed to take huge advantage of was when artworks are guaranteed at auction. So an auction house essentially puts up the money, it then repackages that loan, if you like, to offer as a third party. So we're already in the realms of finance here. But also, I mean, it gets even more extreme. I mean, Sotheby's has just launched a bond that is based on the loans it gives to collectors. I mean, it's become extremely financialized, because these are items that are worth more than most houses and certainly most cars. There is a lot of money around, and people will want to make money from money. And if you're doing that with art, you have to admit that you are financializing it and adhere to some rules.
And this kind of comes down to how artists feel about the market. They obviously, contemporary artists can get very wealthy, rich and famous off the art market, but a lot of artists distance themselves from it. Do you think if it was a little bit more transparent, people would be a little bit more ready to talk about their prices, as it were? Or do you think never the twain shall kind of meet, because people want to be known for their creativity rather than the cost of the works that they produce, I wonder?
I think this does go back to what you were saying about romance. I think artists, and possibly if you are a good artist, maybe that means you don't have a brain for money. I find that difficult to believe is completely true, but I can see that if you want to spend all day creating, you don't want to worry your little head about money, but unfortunately we all do. I also think, in a way, there's a romantic image of an artist starving in a garret, but it's not really that romantic if you're the artist. They need to eat. And then, in fact, another book that I reviewed in the feature you're mentioning by Bianca Bosca talks about artists and indeed, young gallerists really, really struggling to make ends meet and sort of, sleeping on the floors of their gallery and so on and so forth. And I don't think anyone really wants that.
And you raised the idea in this piece as well of younger collectors and the fact that they're not so into this sort of opaque language and rules and regulations such as they are or aren't in the art market as it always has been, that they expect a little bit more oversight and accountability. Can you see their collecting habits? Maybe they're buying cheaper artworks potentially as well, but can you see their habits changing how the art market potentially operates in the future?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a bit of it already. I mean, certainly when people do surveys of, what is a younger collector, but I suppose millennials and younger, the newer entrants to the market. And the surveys always find that one thing that is putting people off is this kind of slight second-hand car salesman mentality and just being worried about being taken for a ride, if you forgive the pun. But I think also one of the attractions of NFTs, yes, they were super, super hyped and it was all a bit crazy. But one of the attractions was this idea that perhaps the blockchain can timestamp, can record transactions. And there is actually a transparency about that appeals. Plus, we're talking about digital natives now. Almost anything you want to find, you can find. And it seems baffling, I think, to newer buyers that you can't find the price of something that's sold before or where it sold before, and that this information is kind of held by a select few who are making money off it.
That was Melanie Gerlis, whose writing appears in the FT, the art newspaper, and elsewhere. Thanks to Melanie and to Orlando Whitfield, of course. What high dudgeon we've learned about on this programme. The art world. Intoxicating, glamorous, almost as if invented by Patricia Highsmith herself. Caveat emptor, kids. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the programme. We'll be back at the same time next week, but for now, I've been Robert Bounds, and thank you very much for tuning in.